Hello, everyone. Welcome to Neuroscience. My name is Dr. Michael Weible, and in today's discussion, we will introduce the primary structure of the diencephalon, the thalamus. Before we begin, I thought I'd offer a couple of tips to maximize our discussion as well as to comment on the note-taking experience. Firstly, our notes are structured narratively, sort of like a book. Each builds on the previous and towards the ensuing. Secondly, as you can see on the screen, our notes are presented on a white background. This is for easy printing. They are sized A3 or can be printed horizontally on A4. As a matter of fact, I do recommend printing your notes, making annotations during our online discussions, and then bringing your notes to our workshops where we'll further elaborate on the concepts. In this regards, I'm going to assist you along the way by suggesting from time to time you make a note. Well, without further ado, let's blank out the screen and we'll begin. Here we have an illustration zoomed in on the mid-sagittal section of the brain. Before we begin our discussions of the diencephalon, let's label a few of the prominent structures of the telencephalon, which we discussed in our previous topic. The corpus callosum, here labeled CC. Recall that the corpus callosum serves as the major commissural bundle connecting the homotopic neocortices between the right and left hemispheres. The septum pellucidum, SP. The septum pellucidum is a thin membrane that separates the left and right lateral ventricles. F labels the body of the fornix. Recall that the fornix originated as the fimbria in the ventromedial temporal lobe, a part of the hippocampus. Initially projecting posteromedially, the fornix wraps up and over the top of the thalamus, progresses anterosuperiorly, and eventually targets a diencephalic structure that we'll soon discuss, the mammillary body, shown here. Since the focus of our discussion is the thalamus, let's go ahead and color it orange. The thalamus is one of 4 major structures of the diencephalon. We'll represent each of these in boxes for clarity in your notes. Interestingly, the word thalamus means anteroom. It's the room before the main room, with the main room being the neocortices. Make a note. Almost all information first goes to the thalamus before being allowed to enter the neocortices. As an example, suppose we reach over and grab a cup of coffee. Before we can execute that motor action, we first consult the thalamus. And when we do have the cup in our hand, before we can experience the texture of the cup, or its warmth, or even the flavor of the coffee in the cup, we first inform the thalamus. In this way, the thalamus acts a little like a gatekeeper, ensuring that only the most crucial information proceeds to the neocortices. This mechanism prevents us from being overwhelmed by extraneous data and allows us to concentrate on what deserves our attention. Incidentally, the small circle in the center of the thalamus is known as the massa intermedia and serves as the commissural bundle between the 2 thalami. The thalamus depicted in our illustration here is the right thalamus and would communicate with the left thalamus through the massa intermedia. You may recall another major landmark we noted in our discussions of the telencephalon, the anterior commissure. If we begin with the anterior commissure and progress inferiorly, we will encounter the optic chiasma, sometimes called the optic chiasm. If we move posteriorly from the optic chiasma, we find the mammillary bodies that we mentioned earlier, the target of the fornix. Triangulating between the anterior commissure, the optic chiasma, and the mammillary bodies allows us to delineate the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is the second of the 4 major diencephalic areas. The hypothalamus is important enough that we're going to have a future discussion dedicated to its function as part of the neuroendocrine system. As a matter of fact, if we could reach through the wall that we colored, we'd encounter a nucleus called the paraventricular nucleus, or PVN. The paraventricular nucleus of the hypothalamus exerts major control over our autonomic nervous system. But that's for a future discussion. Incidentally, neurons of the PVM project through an area called the median eminence. Let's label it here. These neurons form a part of the posterior pituitary gland. We'll label that as well. Both the median eminence and the posterior pituitary are diencephalic structures. The anterior-most aspect of the third ventricle is referred to as the lamina terminalis, or the terminating lamina, and the hypothalamus and thalamus are delineated from one another by the hypothalamic sulcus, illustrated here with a dotted line. The posterior division of the diencephalon is called the epithalamus and will include three main areas. First, the habenular nuclei. The habenular nuclei receive information from the ventral forebrain via the stria medullaris and output to the midbrain to influence the limbic system. The next area is an unpaired midline structure referred to as the pineal gland and, incidentally, gets its name because it looks a little bit like a pine nut. The pineal gland receives information from the retina via the hypothalamus and regulates our circadian rhythms through the release of melatonin. We'll revisit the pineal gland when we talk about the autonomic nervous system as well as the visual pathways. This brings us to the posterior commissure, which plays a role in visual reflexes. We'll see the posterior commissure again when we talk about the visual system. That completes our illustration. Let's review these same structures on a gross mid-sagittal section of the brain. Again, here's the corpus callosum, the septum pellucidum, and the body of the fornix. Using the anterior commissure, optic chiasma, as well as the mammillary body, we can triangulate to find the hypothalamus. The hypothalamic sulcus delineates the hypothalamus from the thalamus. We'll also note this opening referred to as the interventricular foramen, here connecting the right lateral ventricle with the third ventricle. So that cerebral spinal fluid, CSF, that's produced in the lateral ventricle will flow into the third ventricle, mingle with CSF produced in the third ventricle, and together flow through the cerebral aqueduct into the fourth ventricle. Here is the lamina terminalis, or the terminating lamina for the anterior third ventricle. The median eminence, note here that the pituitary has been removed. Posteriorly, we see the habenular nuclei, the pineal gland, and the posterior commissure. For the next part of our discussion, we'll look at the subthalamic nuclei. Here we see an illustration of the left and right thalami. The left side has been divided into the major thalamic groups, and the right side has been divided into the major subthalamic nuclei, each of which will form a component of an ensuing discussion. We'll begin with the anterior group, near the top of the page. The lateral group is lateral to the anterior group, and medially is the medial group. We'll color the medial group orange, since this is the group that we could see on the mid-sagittal illustration, which we colored orange. Lastly is the massa intermedia. Make a note here that the three major groups of the thalamus are delineated by the medullary lamina, the white matter tracts for the thalamus. We'll begin in the anterior group, where the major subthalamic nucleus is the anterior nucleus of the thalamus, or the ant. Recall that we said that the fornix targets the mammillary bodies. Well, the mammillary bodies target the anterior nucleus of the thalamus via the mammillothalamic tract. Make a note here that the anterior nucleus of the thalamus is part of Papez circuit and is critical for episodic memory formation. You may have heard previously that there is an emotional component to memory formation. Well, it will be the anterior nucleus of the thalamus that projects directly into the limbic system for the neocortices. We'll discuss this further in a future topic. Before we move on from the anterior nucleus, I want you to consider the following heuristic. For the entire nervous system, the anterior nervous system generally contains a motor component. And posteriorly, the nervous system generally processes sensory information. While this isn't 100% the case, it is a good rule of thumb. Recall from our notes on the telencephalon that the anterior-most area of the frontal lobe, referred to as the frontal pole, processes executive function. And here in the thalamus, we see that the anterior-most aspect of the thalamus processes information related to episodic memory. Moving posteriorly within the frontal lobe, we encounter neocortices as well as subcortical nuclei that are dedicated to motor movement. Moving posteriorly still within the frontal lobe, we will eventually encounter the primary motor cortex that is the posterior-most area of the frontal lobe. Further still is the central sulcus. If we move posterior to the central sulcus, we're in the parietal lobe and we encounter the primary somatosensory cortex. Eventually, we would enter the occipital lobe where the primary visual cortices are located, and if we wrapped around laterally into the temporal lobe, we would find the auditory cortices. Well, we should see a very similar layout here in the thalamus. Posterior to the anterior nucleus, we should find subthalamic nuclei dedicated to motor movement, and that is what we see. In fact, we have two subthalamic nuclei, the ventral anterior nucleus and the ventral lateral nucleus. Both are part of the somatomotor nervous system. This is the motor nervous system we utilize to move skeletal muscle. We have volitional control over this motor nervous system. Both the ventral anterior and ventral lateral nuclei receive direct input from the basal nuclei, with the ventral lateral nucleus also under the influence of the cerebellum. Similarly to the neocortices, as we move posteriorly in the thalamus, we next encounter subthalamic nuclei important for the somatosensory nervous system. These are the ventral posterolateral nucleus, the VPL, which processes somatosensory information from the upper and lower body, with the sense of touch arriving via the posterior column medial lemniscus, the PCML, and the sense of temperature and nociception from the anterolateral system. Both of these we will have topic discussions on in the future. The ventral posteromedial nucleus, the VPM, processes somatosensory information from the head and neck and does so via the trigeminal system. We'll revisit the trigeminal system when we discuss cranial nerve number 5, the trigeminal nerve. Well, that just leaves two subthalamic nuclei, the lateral geniculate nucleus of the thalamus, the LGN, which receives visual information directly from the retina via the optic nerve, cranial nerve number 2, and the medial geniculate nucleus of the thalamus, the MGN, which processes information as part of the auditory system, a more elaborate system when compared to the visual system. Let's also note here the presence of the pulvinar, which is the largest of the thalamic nuclei and acts as a landmark. Okay, let's take a look at each of our subthalamic nuclei on a series of coronal sections. We'll start anteriorly and note the anterior nucleus of the thalamus, important for episodic memory formation. I also want to note here the hypothalamus and recall this is our neural endocrine system and exerts control over the autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic nervous system, and the parasympathetic nervous system. Lastly, let's color in the ventral anterior nucleus, which we said is important for volitional movement. Moving posteriorly, we can still see the hypothalamus, as well as the ventral posterolateral nucleus, which processes somatosensory information from the upper and lower body, and the ventral posteromedial nucleus, which processes somatosensory information from the head and neck. We can also see the fourth major area of the diencephalon, which is the subthalamus. The subthalamus is important for motor movement, and we'll discuss the subthalamus when we discuss the basal nuclei. That brings us to the posterior-most frontal plane, where we can see the lateral geniculate nucleus. This processes the sense of vision, and the medial geniculate nucleus, MGN, which processes information from the auditory system. Well, that concludes our discussion of the diencephalon, focusing in on the thalamus. I hope you found the topic to be of interest. Until next time, take care. Bye-bye.